Hello class, so today I'll be responding to one of our colleagues, Sean, who spoke about drug legalization being substantially benefiting to the U.S. His claims to support that was, first, legalizing drugs would save the government revenue. Second, the decriminalization of drugs would massively reduce crime. And third, current drug enforcements are failing. My opponent made a good argument and claim, but he lacked sufficient proof to support his evidence and his secondary claims. For example, in his second secondary claim, he did not have enough examples to elaborate on types of crime drugs reduced. And obviously my response to all of this is drug legalization would not benefit the U.S. And again, to review, going into the first claim. So my opponent, again, he stated that legalizing drugs would save government revenue, and I disagree with that. Drug legalization would be costly. So it would benefit the government revenue by putting taxes on certain drugs. For example, a report by Colorado State University in Pueblo, they have an Institute of Cannabis Research. Researchers found that a taxed and regulated cannabis industry contributed more than $58 million to a local economy. So with that being said, it just adds another tax that people pay for drugs, and the cost of drugs in the black market would increase if drugs didn't legalize. Legalizing drugs would mean decreasing prices and increasing consumption. So for example, in the Netherlands, there's a non-enforcement for soft drugs. So marijuana use is doubled among 18 to 25-year-olds. And going on to the second claim. So again, my opponent said decriminalization of drugs would massively reduce crime. And I disagree with that, and I say drugs influence crime. So according to the APA, an American Psychological Association, the United States has only 5% of the world's population and nearly 25% of the world's prisoners, so that's about 2.2 million people. And then according to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, 45.6% of those people are incarcerated for drug offenses. So if drugs were to be legalized, more crime would occur, leading to incarceration rates to increase higher than it already is. And for final claim, again, my opponent said current drug enforcements are failing. I think drug enforcement is being well executed. The DEA and law enforcement does do their job, and they do what is needed around their work and the situation. Like, for example, if you guys have seen Narcos, there's a process into catching or dealing with drug lords, or and there's a difference between catching a drug lord and the guy who's just going to buy a gram of weed. But also, the National Institute on Drug Abuse stated that marijuana significantly impairs judgment and motor coordination and reaction time. And the study showed that the direct relationship between blood THC concentration, it can affect driving ability. So people are not fully capable to drive and can commit a crime. And I think enforcements are dealing with that. Like, for example, I am from Colorado, so one of the first couple states who legalized marijuana, and I've had friends who have been stopped for DUIs, or obviously because they were under the influence, and the law does what they need to do. And then also, main point by Asa Hutchinson, a former DA administrator, recognized that drug use has dropped a third of the rate of what it used to be in the 1970s. So, for example, cocaine use has been down by 40%, and meth has been cut down in half. So it just shows that drug enforcement is being well executed. So overall, drugs should be legalized. Drug legalization would be costly. drugs influence crime and drug enforcement is well executed. Thank you for your time.
All right, well, you outlined the advocate structure pretty clearly. On the first point, when you say wouldn't be costly, or it would be costly, it's kind of interesting. The advocates of drug legalization would usually say that raising $58 million in revenue would be an advantage, and you're saying it's a disadvantage because it's basically a tax. It's an interesting interpretation of that particular problem. I think you've got maybe a better argument to suggest that there's a black market impact that's going to change when drugs are legalized, and that's going to make the drugs either more available to people at a lower price and therefore increase their use, and maybe potentially create bigger problems, especially among younger groups. I think that's the way that argument ought to be developed. The very next point that you make suggests that, because you use the Netherlands policy of mostly non-enforcement for use, and you have a good piece of data that documents a doubling of the amount of marijuana users in the Netherlands. Your argument about the prison population is another one that could be going the other direction. A lot of people who advocate for drug legalization point out that we have 25% of the world's prisoners, although we only have 5% of the population, and half of those prisoners there because they're being incarcerated for drug crimes. And their position would be that means that we are putting people in prison that nobody else is putting in prison, and that seems like it's a waste of time and money. And you kind of look at it and say, well, it shows that there's a lot of crime that's going on there. I think there are other crimes that go along with some of the drug laws that are not being discussed here, and I think that that's where you probably needed to focus on this a little bit. So this documentary over the weekend about Seattle and their drug problems, that they have homelessness. They got a big homeless problem up there, and it's like there are 3,500 property crimes a week that are committed in the area, and almost all of them are attributable to the drug users in the homeless population up there. And it's like, that's the kind of stuff that says there is a consequence to drug legalization because we're going to have more of that as a result. That's, I think, the way that argument can be developed. And then you kind of talk about the effectiveness of the drug laws. I think you're just kind of reflexively answering the advocate's position here, taking a contrary position. I don't know Narcos very well, so I mean, I've heard of the shows and those programs. I know that there's prosecution of big drug lords, and there is a difference. I think you could point out, for instance, that most average users don't get severely punished by the system, but that's not where the real problem is. The real problem are people who are exploiting the system and exploiting people in the system, and that's what creates the problems. The drunk driving thing comparison, you make it sound like it's a problem for your friends who got prosecuted for this. I think the argument is that when drugs are legalized, people use them more, and that creates problems for society. That's the way that argument needs to be developed. You've got the right point there, you've got the right information in there, but you're making a strange point with it, and that seemed a little bit confusing. All right, thank you.